deep in the folds of eastern Kentucky, where the land pressed in like a secret. Hills folded over hills, creeks cut through limestone, and fog lingered longer than it should. Few outsiders ever wandered there, and those who did rarely spoke of it twice. It was a place forgotten by time, by census takers, by the maps that grew fainter the farther you traced your finger east. Yet within those hills, one family endured, a clan that refused the world and, in return, was refused by it. The people in nearby towns had a name for them, though it was spoken only in low tones, not from cruelty, but from unease. They were said to keep to themselves, to live by their own rules, to never take wives or husbands from outside their blood. Their children were pale and quiet, their eyes distant, their speech strange and slow, as though each word cost effort to remember. It was said they carried old habits, old fears, and something older still, a belief that purity meant safety, that blood unbroken was a shield against the world's corruption. The first stories appeared in whispers during the late 1850s, when a traveling doctor claimed to have treated a child from the hills, blue-skinned, frail, and silent, with a heartbeat he described as unnaturally calm. He said the mother watched him closely, her gaze cold and steady, while the father stood in the doorway holding a lantern that barely moved even in the wind. When asked the child's name, neither of them answered. They simply turned away, as if language no longer served a purpose between them. For decades, the people of that valley lived apart. Their world existed in quiet repetitions, planting, harvesting, burying, marrying, always marrying. The same surnames reappeared on every hand-carved gravestone, fading into one another until it became impossible to tell where one ended and another began. Outsiders wondered if they even remembered the difference between kin and stranger. But within the clan, there was no confusion. They believed they were keeping something sacred alive, something the rest of the world had forgotten. When the Civil War came, soldiers passed through those hills, desperate for shelter and food. A few were taken in by the family, fed, given water, and never seen again. Rumors spread that the clan had no use for soldiers, that they did not understand the war or care for its sides, that they saw all men from outside as diseased, as something to be cleansed from their valley. Others said they hid from fear of being discovered, of someone naming what they had become. In 1860, a man from Lexington, a census taker, made the journey up the mountain road to count the living. His notes, preserved in a courthouse archive, mention a small homestead where no strangers are welcome. He wrote of unusual skin tones and intermarried relations extending for generations. His report ended abruptly. Weeks later, his horse was found wandering near the creek, his papers soaked through, his signature missing from the final page. What happened in those hills remains uncertain. Some say disease claimed them all. Others believe they still live there. The descendants of those who chose blood over all else, hidden beneath the thick woods and shale. Their houses may have fallen, their fields reclaimed by vines, but on quiet nights, travelers claim to see lantern light moving through the fog, slow and deliberate, as though someone is still tending to the old ways. And when locals hear that story, the one about the family who married only each other, they don't ask if it's true. They ask if it ever really ended. In the mid-19th century, Kentucky was a land divided not just by the coming war, but by its very geography. The lowlands near the Ohio River pulsed with trade, tobacco, and talk of progress. But the eastern hills, where our story breathes, were another world entirely. Jagged ridges, deep hollows, and winding rivers carved through limestone made travel nearly impossible. Roads, when they existed, were little more than dirt paths swallowed by trees. In those hills, people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. Isolation shaped everything. Families built their cabins in the folds of valleys, clearing only what land they needed to survive. They relied on barter, not money. Corn, salt pork, and homemade liquor were the currency of survival. The church was often a single-room structure that doubled as a meeting hall, a school, and sometimes even a courtroom. But there were places, further in, beyond the last church bell's reach, where no preacher came and no lawman rode. That is where this clan's story begins. By 1860, intermarriage among distant kin wasn't entirely uncommon in rural Appalachia. The population was sparse, and travel between settlements could take days through treacherous terrain. But what happened in the hills near eastern Kentucky went beyond convenience or lack of options. It became custom, a belief, a system unto itself. Generations married within the same family line, turning isolation into tradition. To outsiders, it might have looked like madness. But for those inside, it was a way to preserve what they believed was purity, a form of loyalty to blood and ancestry that had taken on the weight of religion. Some whispered that the clan's founders had fled persecution in the old country, bringing with them superstitions about keeping bloodlines unbroken to protect from curses, disease, or the taint of outsiders. Whether that was true, no one could say, but what is certain is that their world shrank inward with every passing generation. Their land was unforgiving. Winters were long, summers humid and heavy with insects. Farming the rocky soil demanded everything, and what little they grew, corn, beans, a few pigs, barely kept them alive. Their children were born at home, often delivered by their own kin, without a doctor or midwife. Records from the 1840s and 1850s show unusually high rates of stillbirth and deformity in some valleys, though the causes were not understood then. Local doctors, few as they were, chalked it up to poor breeding stock or mountain sickness. In truth, it was something more familiar to modern eyes, generations of genetic isolation, slowly revealing itself in the body. The community outside those hills, meanwhile, was transforming. Railroads were beginning to creep across the country. Industry promised a new America, connected, fast, and restless. But in these mountains, time didn't move that way. Here, memory was circular. The dead were buried on the same ground as their grandparents, their graves marked by rough stones and carved initials. Names repeated down generations until fathers, sons, and grandsons shared not just blood, but identity. Education barely existed. A few could read the Bible. Most relied on oral history, stories, superstitions, and family rules. They believed in signs. Birds that flew against the wind meant death. A dog howling at midnight foretold sickness, and twins were the mark of divine favor or punishment depending on the year's harvest. Science had no foothold there. Medicine was herbs, poultices, and prayers. To them, outsiders were a threat. Not because of violence, but because of contamination. Those who ventured too far down the mountain road were met with silence. Not hostility, just a refusal to acknowledge their existence. They were ghosts to one another. The 1860s brought rumors of soldiers disappearing, of pale children spotted near the riverbanks at dawn, of funerals that never seemed to end. But such talk remained local folklore. No journalist ever came. No law investigated. The Civil War made sure of that. The world's chaos drowned out the whispers of a few strange families in Kentucky. And yet, every generation that passed, the physical traits of the clan became more pronounced. The skin tone, once fair, grew ashen, a bluish tint that caught the light strangely. Their speech slowed, their posture stiffened, their hearing dulled. It was as if their bodies were folding inward, collapsing under the weight of their own bloodline. Outsiders, when they caught sight of them, described them as unearthly. But perhaps the most disturbing part was not their appearance. It was their calmness. They did not seem aware that anything was wrong. To them, life was simply continuing as it always had. Marriage was duty, birth was purpose, and death was rest. When someone died, they were buried quickly and quietly, often within hours. Graves dotted the family's property like punctuation marks, a pattern of continuity. This was not evil, nor cruelty. It was ignorance wrapped in ritual. The clan was not trying to harm anyone. They were surviving the only way they knew, cut off from progress, untouched by education or medicine. But nature does not forgive isolation forever. By the late 1850s, scientists in the wider world were just beginning to study heredity, though they wouldn't understand genetics for decades more. In cities, the concept of degeneration was whispered in academic halls. In these mountains, it was living reality. The people here didn't need theories. They were the evidence, walking and breathing among the fog. In time, their way of life would vanish, swallowed by modernity, by roads and schooling, by the government's push to catalog every life. But for a brief moment, just before the war, the clan that married only each other stood as a haunting relic of something older than science and darker than sin, a community where blood was law, love was duty, and the outside world was something to be feared. not for what it might do to them, but for what it might reveal about who they had become. It began, as most tragedies do, with something small, a birth that did not go as planned. One winter evening in 1861, the eldest daughter of the clan, barely 16, gave birth to twins. The labor lasted 3 days. The midwife was her aunt, her husband her cousin, and the child's father, by blood, something even closer. When the first infant was born, it was silent. The second arrived gasping for air, its skin gray, its cry thin and wavering. The family gathered around the bed in the dim lamplight, whispering prayers, while snow fell against the window. No doctor was called. None ever were. For weeks afterward, the surviving child lay wrapped in quilts, its eyes unfocused, its limbs stiff. They believed it was cursed, touched by a spirit. They hung dried herbs above the cradle, whispered charms to ward off the mountain sickness. The baby lived, but never learned to speak. Years later, neighbors who claimed to have seen it said its skin had a strange bluish cast, almost translucent under the sun. Then came the sickness. In the summer of 1863, several members of the family fell ill. Their stomachs bloated, their eyes sank. They blamed the water from the well, said it had gone bad after a lightning strike. The clan dug a new one higher up the ridge, but the illness returned. No one thought to connect it to the same shared blood that coursed through them all. One by one, they grew weaker. Some went blind, others deaf, yet no one left. One night, a young man, barely 20, tried. He took his father's horse and rode through the trees toward town. He didn't make it far. By dawn, the horse came back alone. His body was later found near the creek, face down in the mud, neck twisted at an impossible angle. The family said it was an accident, that he had fallen. Others whispered something different, that he had been stopped. Not by force, but by faith. That he had changed his mind when he reached the river and turned back, only to meet something waiting for him in the fog. The stories multiplied. A child wandering too close to the woods saw figures moving at dusk, people who looked familiar but didn't move like people should. A mother swore she heard her dead husband's voice whisper her name through the window pane. Sometimes the animals reacted first, chickens refusing to lay, cows bellowing through the night, dogs running off and never returning. Inbreeding had taken its toll not just on their bodies but on their minds. Hallucinations, paranoia, violence, each generation grew more unpredictable. Arguments over food turned bloody. A man was struck with a hoe during a quarrel and buried before morning. A woman was found wandering barefoot in the snow, humming lullabies to no one. When asked about her child, she simply said, "He went into the trees." The Civil War raged far beyond their valley, yet somehow its echoes reached them. Union soldiers on patrol once followed a smoke trail into the hollow. What they found sent them running back down the ridge. They described it later in letters, a cluster of cabins, each smaller than the last, and inside, people with pale faces and hollow eyes staring wordlessly from the dark. The soldiers said it felt like walking into a graveyard that still breathed. None of them went back. By 1865, most nearby towns had heard whispers of the mountain family. Local papers hinted at a degenerate clan living in unholy seclusion. Ministers from the lowlands called them proof of sin. Scientists, those few who read about them in obscure journals, saw them as evidence of hereditary decay. The people themselves, however, knew none of this. They continued as they always had, marrying, birthing, burying. Some nights, blue fires were seen burning on the hilltops. Locals claimed it was swamp gas or the spirits of the dead. Others said it was the family performing rites to keep outsiders away. The truth was more mundane and more horrifying. They burned the bodies of those who died during childbirth or sickness, believing fire would release their souls from the curse. The smoke carried a smell the wind could not forget. As the years passed, deformities worsened. Some children were born with twisted limbs, others with no eyes. A few lived into adulthood, their faces warped by generations of repetition. They were not monsters. They were human beings, shaped by isolation, molded by superstition, and failed by the world that left them behind. But to travelers passing through, their appearance told another story. Ghosts, they called them. Witches, said others. The cursed ones. The final tragedy came in 1870. A fire broke out one winter night in the largest cabin. By the time the flames were seen from the next ridge, it was too late. The fire consumed nearly everything, the records, the tools, the few heirlooms they had kept. Only 2 survivors were found wandering near the creek the next morning, a woman with hair white as snow and a small boy clutching her hand. Neither spoke a word. When townsfolk tried to take them in, the woman refused food, refused touch. She died within days. The boy disappeared the following week. After that, no one went back up the mountain. The hollow grew silent. Grass overtook the paths and rain swallowed the ashes. By the turn of the century, only locals remembered the name. But even they stopped speaking it aloud. Some said the bloodline had finally ended. Others whispered that it hadn't, that a few had moved deeper into the woods where no map could follow. Today, hikers sometimes find traces. A half-buried well, fragments of pottery, rusted tools. Once a human jawbone was found lodged in the roots of a tree, the teeth still intact. No one can prove it belonged to them. But those who live nearby say that on certain cold nights, if you walk the old trail and listen closely, you can still hear voices drifting through the mist. Low, drawn-out syllables that sound almost like names being repeated over and over by people who never learned to stop calling their own blood back to them. When the stories began to drift down from the hills, no one believed them at first. Farmers along the valley edge spoke of strange fires at night, of the sound of weeping that carried through fog even when no one was there. A few thought it was just the wind crossing the ridges. Others said it was the ghosts of Union soldiers still lost in the forest. But the truth, the rumor of a family who had lived for generations without leaving their hollow, marrying only their own, spread slowly, like smoke that refuses to clear. By 1866, the town of Letcher had grown uneasy. The war had ended, but poverty lingered. People were trying to rebuild, to replant, to forget. Yet the hollow up north remained a wound on the edge of their peace. The preacher in the white clapboard church began to mention the sins of solitude in his Sunday sermons. He warned that man was not meant to be apart from God's order, that blood should not circle back upon itself. The congregation nodded, though few had ever seen the family. Fear didn't need evidence, it only needed distance. A few curious men tried to see for themselves. One of them was a traveling doctor from Lexington. He had heard whispers of a genetic affliction among the mountain folk and saw an opportunity for study. He rode north, notebook in hand, but returned only a week later, thin, pale, unwilling to speak. The only thing he wrote afterward was a single line: "Some things are not meant to be observed." His colleagues dismissed him as a romantic fool. But those who saw him afterward said he never quite looked anyone in the eye again. The newspapers caught scent of the story next. Local papers printed short columns about degenerate mountaineers and unfortunate results of isolation. They wrote it as cautionary tales, moral lessons for the educated and the pious. Illustrations were added, exaggerated sketches of malformed figures, more fiction than fact. Yet the public devoured them. Fear sold better than truth. Soon, the Kentucky clan became a whispered warning for children. Obey your kin or you'll end up like them. But beneath the ridicule, there was a quieter fascination. A few scholars, particularly those studying heredity, began to see the clan not as monsters, but as victims of circumstance. In 19th century America, scientific curiosity often danced uneasily with prejudice. Terms like atavism and moral decay appeared in journals, attempts to explain human suffering through cold observation. They never visited the site. None of them wanted to. Meanwhile, the nearby communities began to change how they behaved. People stopped cutting timber near the northern ridge. Hunters refused to set traps there, even when deer tracks were fresh. When travelers went missing in the woods, it was simply accepted. They must have wandered too close. Families began locking their doors at night, something they had never done before. The superstition wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. Pastors framed it as divine punishment. Doctors described it as the inevitable end of tainted bloodlines. Mothers told their children it was the devil's work. But those who had lived closest to the hollow, those who remembered seeing smoke rise from it, whispered something different. That the family had wanted to end themselves. That the fire that consumed their cabins wasn't an accident at all. In 1871, a small expedition, led by the county sheriff and a group of locals, ventured up the mountain to confirm what remained. They found little more than charred beams and ashes. Bones too, though not many. The sheriff refused to discuss the details. One deputy, who quit a few weeks later, claimed he saw something in the ashes that looked like a child's hand clutching a rusted ring. Others said the ground was still warm beneath their boots, even after all those years. The site was eventually marked on county maps as abandoned land. No one claimed it, no one rebuilt. Nature took it back. The hollows became overgrown, trees swallowing what was left of the cabins. By the 1880s, new settlers had moved into the nearby valley, drawn by cheap land and good soil. They didn't know the story or pretended not to. But sometimes, when their livestock went missing or their wells soured, the old fears returned. "The blood's still up there," they'd mutter, half joking, half afraid. As the decades passed, the story drifted between folklore and history. Traveling preachers used it as sermon material. Folklorists collected fragments of it from locals who remembered the ghostkin. In time, the tale softened. It became a ghost story, stripped of its human tragedy, and turned into entertainment for the curious. But in certain corners, libraries, university archives, old newspapers on brittle paper, the truth still lurks. The family's existence wasn't fiction. There are birth records, death certificates, all bearing the same surname repeating for generations. There are medical notes describing rare deformities, and in one forgotten notebook, a line from an anonymous physician. They loved each other as all people do, only they were too far from the world to know how to stop. And so, the memory of the clan lingers not as a tale of monsters, but of a society that turned away. It is easier to call something cursed than to ask what made it so. It was the last winter anyone spoke of the clan aloud. The snow that year came early, heavy enough to silence the woods. Even the river froze at its edges, as if nature itself held its breath. By January, the smoke that sometimes rose from the northern ridge had disappeared entirely. No movement, no sign of life, just the outline of collapsed roofs beneath the frost. The town grew restless. Curiosity and guilt tangled together. Had they vanished? Had they fled deeper into the mountains? Or had they, as some whispered, turned inward completely, sealing their fate in the name of blood and belief? One man decided to find out. He was not a preacher, nor a scholar, nor a lawman, just a widower whose daughter had disappeared the previous autumn after wandering too far north to gather chestnuts. For months, he'd searched the woods alone, leaving offerings by tree roots, whispering her name into the dark. But when the rumors began that the clan folk had taken her, something in him broke. He left before dawn, carrying only a lantern, a small axe, and his daughter's scarf. The snow fell harder the farther he climbed. By noon, the world was only white and silence. The trees leaned inward like they were listening. He followed what looked like an old path, the remnants of wagon ruts long buried under moss and frost. He didn't realize he'd found the hollow until he stepped into it. The cabins were almost gone, just blackened ribs of timber jutting from the ground. In the center stood a single house still intact, though its roof sagged under the snow. The air was still. No wind, no birds, the kind of stillness that presses against your chest. He raised his lantern and saw shapes inside the window. People, or what had once been people, sitting upright in chairs around a table. He pushed the door open, and the sound it made, long, slow, groaning, echoed like something exhaling. The smell hit him first. Not rot, not exactly. Something dry, metallic, preserved by cold and ash. The figures inside were frozen in place, their skin the color of candle wax. They faced one another, hands touching, their eyes sealed shut. Every one of them wore a thin, pale smile. At the head of the table was a woman, her hair white, her face calm. Before her sat a bowl filled with something blackened and shriveled. Around her, the rest of the family seemed caught mid-prayer. The man stepped closer, his breath shaking. He thought he heard a whisper then, soft, low, almost tender. His daughter's name. The scarf slipped from his hand. His lantern shook. One of the bodies shifted slightly, just enough that the chair creaked. He stumbled backward, eyes wide, certain one of them had breathed. But when he turned toward the door, the light from the lantern flickered and went out. For a moment, everything was gone. The world, the air, the sound. Just the faint crackle of something burning beneath the floorboards. He fell to his knees, clawing through the dark until the snow outside reflected enough light for him to see. Flames were rising from beneath the table now, slow and steady, as if someone had been waiting for him to come. He ran. He didn't look back until he reached the ridge, lungs tearing in the cold. The hollow below glowed orange through the fog, and for the first time in decades, the mountain echoed with sound. Screams, yes, but not of pain. They were hymns, low and rhythmic, a dozen voices chanting in unison as the fire spread. The widower dropped to his knees in the snow, unable to move. He said later that the flames didn't look like destruction, but release. By morning, the smoke had cleared. The hollow was nothing but ash. The man never spoke again, not even to his neighbors who found him wandering the valley the next day, frostbitten and silent. He lived another 5 years, kept indoors, eyes distant. When he died, they found a small lock of hair tied around his wrist. The sheriff led one final expedition into the hollow that spring. All they found were fragments: a rusted ring, the base of a burned table, and a single set of footprints leading into the woods that did not return. The ashes were cool, but the earth beneath was still warm. They said the family had chosen the fire, that they had lit it themselves in a final act of devotion, bound together by their blood and their faith. But there were others who said the fire had started on its own, sparked by the curse of too much love twisted into something unholy. The truth was buried with them, and perhaps that was mercy. Afterward, people avoided the ridge entirely. The town stopped mentioning the clan. Children born after 1870 grew up without knowing the name. The past, it seemed, had been cleansed by silence. Yet every so often, when the wind carried east, those who lived nearest the edge of the woods swore they could still hear the faint sound of singing, soft, almost human, rising from the ashes of the hollow. And sometimes, when fog crept low enough, they said they could see shapes in it, men and women standing close together, faces pale, hands clasped, smiling faintly through the mist as if waiting to be remembered. By the turn of the century, the story of the family had faded into something half remembered, half denied. The old people still knew, though they rarely spoke of it. If asked, they would simply look away and mutter that some things are best left in the dark. The ridge itself became overgrown, claimed by pine and laurel, its trails erased by rain and time. Only a few broken stones hinted that lives had once been lived there. In 1902, a surveyor from Louisville came to map the area for a planned rail line. He found the hollow by accident. His notes, later recovered from a local archive, mentioned the peculiar stillness of the air and a faint smell of smoke, as though something long buried was smoldering just beneath the soil. He wrote that he camped there one night, but his final entry breaks off mid-sentence. The last line trembling across the page. Voices, soft and near, calling names that are not mine. He never finished the survey. His employers assumed he'd gone home. His body was never found. By then, the world had moved on. The Civil War, Reconstruction, industrial expansion. America had forgotten the small tragedies of its hills. Yet even as cities grew and science replaced superstition, the old stories still held power. The tale of the Kentucky clan persisted in folklore, told around campfires and in quiet kitchens. It became a parable about isolation, about the danger of turning inward too far. But under the moralizing tones, something deeper remained, a sense of sorrow, not evil. Modern historians who stumble upon the few existing records view the story differently. They see not monsters but victims of geography and neglect. The 19th century Appalachian hollows were places of exile in all but name. Remote, impoverished, forgotten by state and church alike. Families survived as they could, marrying within their own because no one else came. Over time, the isolation became their curse. What the town called sin may have been only loneliness, and yet, there are things the records can't explain. In 1973, an anthropologist from the University of Kentucky visited the area after hearing local legends. She interviewed elderly residents who still lived near the valley's edge. One woman, nearly 90, told her that on cold nights, the ridge still glows faintly, like embers that refuse to die. When asked what she thought caused it, the old woman only said, "They ain't gone. They're just waiting." The anthropologist dismissed it as rural superstition until her tape recorder malfunctioned during playback. The interview was clear for the first 10 minutes, then filled with static. Beneath the noise, a faint rhythmic sound repeated every few seconds. She described it in her field notes as something between a hum and a prayer. Even now, the hollow remains untouched. No one builds there. No one digs. The land is marked as privately owned, though no deed exists. The forest has grown thick, swallowing the remnants of chimneys and walls. In spring, wildflowers bloom in strange, symmetrical patterns, as if following the outlines of something no longer seen.
Those who wander close sometimes speak of hearing laughter, soft, childlike, cut short by silence. Others claim to have seen figures standing at the edge of the fog, pale and motionless, watching. Hunters avoid the area, saying their dogs refuse to enter. Locals refer to it simply as the quiet place. The deeper tragedy of the clan lies not in what they did, but in what they became, a reflection of humanity's fear of itself. Their story reminds us how easily the world can turn its back on what it doesn't understand. In their desperate attempt to keep their bloodline pure, they sealed themselves away from the very world that might have saved them. They were not the first nor the last to mistake survival for sanctity. And maybe that is why their story endures, because it feels too familiar. The line between devotion and destruction is thinner than we admit. In a time when people sought purity, they found only fire. And in that fire, perhaps they thought they'd cleanse themselves of sin. No one can say for certain what happened that final night. Whether they lit the flames willingly or fell victim to something darker. But when you stand at the ridge today, where the trees grow denser and the air turns heavy, you can still feel it, a pulse beneath the soil, faint but steady. Some call it memory, others a curse. But the locals have a simpler explanation. They say the family never truly left. They just went quiet, waiting beneath the ground where blood still remembers.